question that when you think about the fact that he actually wrote that. But it must be true because the Bible says it. But I do think it's kind of funny when you think about it that way. Chapter 18, I think, is evidence of the fact that he was incredibly humble. I mean, it's one thing to take advice from your own parents, to sort of obey your own mother, right? But to take advice from your in-laws is a whole other thing, right? And especially in Moses' case, here he was the deliverer, the one person chosen to do this impossible task of taking the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. And by God's power, he did it. He was the one that God met with personally and spoke to. He was the mediator, the one who foreshadowed the ultimate mediator, Jesus Christ. He was the one that God chose, the most important man in the Middle East, really. And yet, he listened to Jethro, his father-in-law, who wasn't even Jewish. He listened to him, and he took his advice. And to give Jethro honor the way that he did, he must have been a humble person. Dwight Moody, who was a great Bible teacher, said this: Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning that he was a nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. I suspect that when you meet with the living God, when you have an actual physical exchange, an encounter with him, when he appears to you physically, you probably end up with a greater sense of your own smallness in relation to him. And when we learn what God can do with a nobody, it frees us up to do more, to take more risks, do harder things, even take excellent advice from your father-in-law. C.S. Lewis said that true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It's a good way to think of it. All right, on to chapter 19, if you want to turn there with me, please. Chapter 19 focuses on Yahweh setting the terms of the relationship between Israel and himself, between himself and his people. Now, he has already delivered his people. They have already been saved from their bondage in Egypt, but the terms of this relationship had not really been established yet. To put it in dating terms, they had not defined their relationship yet. They know Yahweh, but they're going to get to know him a whole lot better. Chapter 19 shows us how Yahweh absolutely stuns Israel with his consuming fire, his blazing holiness, and his terrifying glory. This terrifying God is the God who calls them and who makes covenant with them. He is both terrifyingly holy and tender-heartedly gracious. So the people have been continuing through the wilderness, and now they are in the third month after having been rescued from Egypt, and here they are at Mount Sinai, right back at the place where Moses first encountered God in the burning bush. We read about that in chapter 3, that Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, and then he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb and Sinai are the same mountain. I'm sure you've discovered that by now. In chapter 3, verse 12, God said to Moses, "I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." God had promised to bring Moses to this mountain, and he did it. I mean, can you imagine what that moment must have been like for Moses, coming back to that very same mountain, the place where he had first met God, and God had given him this crazy, impossible task. But at this point in the story, God had accomplished that crazy, impossible task. He had delivered them. They had endured so much, all the plagues, all the discouragement, the miraculous rescue, walking through the Red Sea, seeing bitter water turned into drinkable water, manna in the morning, quail in the evening, all the grumbling and the anger. And there they were. God had done the impossible. I'm sure that was quite a moment for Moses as he stood there thinking, Yahweh, we are right where you said we would be. Worshiping God on this mountain. You have freed this people from their bondage so that they can worship you. God had kept his promise. The Israelites had arrived at Sinai. Now God knew that Moses would get this assignment. God knew long before he ever spoke to Moses that they would be going south to Sinai. This was not the direct route. That would have been east to Palestine. God knew long before Moses was ever born. God knew before Joseph ever landed up in Egypt that this moment would happen, that they would pitch their tents at the base of the mountain, and it was at this mountain that they were to be with the Lord. And here, the most significant event in Israel's history, the establishment of the covenant, would take place. It was a continuation of the covenant that God had made with Abraham so long before. This was quite a moment. But let's just think for 1 minute about where they were going. They were heading to Palestine, the land of milk and honey, the broad and spacious land. God had promised them a good land, a land of milk and honey. Now, what does that mean? That means cows and grass and green pastures and water and flowers and bees and loveliness. But they find themselves here in Sinai, and this is not a good land. It's worse than Egypt, actually. There is no milk here. It's a desert. It's barren. Sinai was further away from where they were going than Egypt was. It was in the opposite direction from Palestine. You can look at the map on page 185 in the back of your book. God led them south to Sinai, nowhere near their destination. God had told Moses way back at the burning bush, when Yahweh first called him, that they would be coming to Sinai. It was all part of the plan. Alec Mature wrote a commentary on the book of Exodus from the Bible Speaks series. It's an excellent book, and I'm relying very heavily on a lot of it for chapter 19. And he says that God, through Moses, is saying to the people, trust me, trust us, trust God, and trust Moses. In fact, in verse 9 of chapter 19, it says that the people at the base of the mountain will actually hear God speaking to Moses, so they will trust him as well as God. God had surely brought them to himself, and he is going to allow now all of the people to hear what he said, not just Moses, and that is an incredible thing. That means that they, along with Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and Moses, will also hear the voice of God for themselves, so that they will be assured that God is with them. That is an incredible thing. But we're going to read in next week's lesson that they were so scared, they didn't want to hear the voice of God. They begged Moses not to make them hear God's voice. They were so terrified. God is saying through Moses, we are taking you to a land of honey and milk, Palestine. But first, we're going here in the desert, the opposite of where we're going, both opposite in place, in kind of place, and in direction. And it seems to me that that is often true in our lives as well. You give your life to the Lord and resolve to live for Him, and sometimes things don't get better. Sometimes, at first, things get worse. You thought that following Christ would give you whatever, fill in the blank, ABC. And instead, maybe you received the opposite end of the alphabet, XYZ. And you're actually further from the things that you thought you'd have than you were when you first started this journey with God. Maybe you thought by now your children or your husband would come around to your new understanding of the Lord, of yourself, of the world. Or maybe you thought he would get that job that you need, or you would get that job that you need, or your finances would be straightened out and your health would be better and you'd be stronger. Whatever is on your list, it can go on and on. And God seems to be taking you in the opposite direction, a little bit like the strange path he took Joseph on. You remember that story. His brothers despised him because Jacob clearly favored Joseph, so his brothers sold him into slavery and told his father that he was dead. And Joseph cried out to the Lord for years, and nothing. Silence. Eventually, there was a happy ending, but it came after a long time and a strange detour to Egypt, far away from the home that Joseph loved and longed for, after a lot of pain, a lot of disappointment, and a lot of loneliness. But it was God's grace to Joseph. It was actually God's grace to all of Egypt. It was God's grace to Jacob and his sons as well. Grace shows up in our lives sometimes in unexpected and even unwanted ways. For Joseph, who became the hero of the known world because he saved everyone from famine, grace came by way of a pit and some hateful brothers. For Jesus and for us, grace came by way of a cross. That's often how grace works in our lives. You can almost hear Israel in your head saying, hey, what's going on here? I thought we were following God. We followed that pillar, and look where we are. Maybe you can relate. John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. He knew well of what he wrote. He used to be a slave trader. He was a prominent slave trader until he met Jesus Christ, who changed him, completely transformed him, so that he would sing Christ's praises in that last line, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We'll have no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. That is quite an about-face, from slave trader to Christ praiser. He wrote, everything God sends, everything is needful that God sends. Nothing can be needful that he withholds. When the order of grace in our lives seems a little bit strange and a little off, we need to think on that. God did not save you to make your life perfect. He saved you to bring you to himself. As it says in verse 4 of chapter 19, I brought you to myself. Their deliverance from slavery was not just liberation, it was adoption as sons and daughters. He brought them out of Egypt and carried them through the wilderness to bring them to himself, to make them his very own. It says on verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Deuteronomy 32, 10 through 12 has an interesting and beautiful description of the same thing. It says this, in a desert land he found him. In a barren and howling waste he shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers around its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carry them aloft. The Lord alone led them. No foreign God was with them. Have you ever thought about what that means to be carried on eagle's wings, to be saved on eagle's wings? I love the movies, the Lord of the Rings movies. We often watch them around Thanksgiving. And there are a couple of epic moments in that movie when the characters are carried away from harm on eagle's wings. What does it mean? It means you don't do anything. It's all the eagle. In the movie, the eagle comes in and swept them up and carried them away from danger. Otherwise, they would have died. To be carried away on eagle's wings means that the eagle does all the saving. The eagle does the work. It's sheer grace. The Lord is saying to his people, this is all me. I have saved you through sheer grace. You don't do anything to save yourself. You are carried away by me. So God is saying, I carried you on eagle's wings. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then I will make you a treasured possession. Now, this is an interesting part. We're going to follow along verses 4 through 6 and try to listen carefully because God lays out here something that is so terribly important. He lays out what Alec Motyer calls the order of grace. This is what it says, starting with verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So he saved them. He delivered them out of the land of Egypt, out of their bondage, out of their slavery, and he brought them to himself, brought them to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, where he had promised to bring them by his presence. He guided them by his presence to his greater presence. Verse 5 says, God says, for all the earth is mine. I own everything. He owns everything. They were his already. He had already delivered them out of Egypt, but he said, if you will obey my voice and keep this covenant, then you will be a treasured possession, a people special to me and cherished by me. He makes a covenant with them, a covenant that precedes the law. Now, generally, a covenant is defined as a mutual agreement between two or more parties. And this covenant sets the stage for the giving of the Ten Commandments that we're going to talk about next week. Notice he does not compel them by force to accept his lordship over them, but he reminds them of what he has already done for them. He reminds them of the love that he has already shown to them. He sort of woos them into a deeper relationship with me. If you obey, then you will be my treasured possession, my jewel, my gem. Alec Motyer says that the sequence of these central elements is extremely important for understanding the entire Bible. The order of grace, as he puts it, the sequence is this. Verse 4, the saving acts of God. Verse 5a, our response of obedience. Obey fully and keep the covenant. Verse 5b and c, the blessing, the response brings, you will be a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. So it's saving, obedience, and blessing. And he goes on to say that nothing must ever upset this order. Now, I've probably said this about a dozen times since we started this year, but you notice that God did not give them the law. Have them say, okay, we're going to do everything that the law tells us to do. And God says, great, see how you go, see how it goes, and then I will save you. He doesn't do that. He saves them first. He says, I will take you out of Egypt on eagle's wings. The order is salvation by grace, obedience, and blessing. Eagle's wings, sheer grace. Matthias says that the Passover, the Exodus, Mount Sinai, the whole story is the largest visual aid ever planned of the gospel. And he says something like this. It's not an exact quote, but it's close. If you had asked a Hebrew what had happened to him, he would say, I was in bondage. I took shelter under the blood of the Lamb. I was led out by my mediator. I was saved by the mighty arm of God. Then God showed me how to live out my salvation. He gave me a way of dealing with my sins through the atoning blood of Christ. The Christian says the very same thing. I was in bondage. My slavery was to sin. I took shelter under the blood of the Lamb. I was led out by my mediator, Jesus. I was saved by the mighty arm of God. Then God showed me how to live out my salvation, gave me a way of dealing with my sins through the atoning blood of our spotless Lamb, Jesus. And God is taking me where I want to go, and he's teaching me how to live out that salvation. He's bringing me into the promised land. The Exodus is the gospel, and the order is critical. It is grace, obedience, and then blessing. Now, as far as the Ten Commandments go, there's a couple of different ways, well, probably 3 different ways that people look at that, look at the receiving of the law and the order of that receiving. I mean, one thing, of course, is people just don't care. If you don't believe in God and you don't care, then you're going to completely disregard the 10 Commandments and not even think about them. But if you do care, if you do believe that there is a God, then there are a couple of ways that people order the receiving of the law. For example, some people believe law comes first. Law first, and then deliverance. The gospel says deliverance first, and then law. If you are a law first person and then deliverance, you would say, we obey, and therefore God accepts us. But the gospel says deliverance first, and then law. So the gospel-loving person would say, I am accepted, therefore I obey. And nothing is more important to understand than that. Because both of these people are trying to obey the 10 Commandments, right? They're both trying to live them out. The first person, I obey, therefore I'm accepted. The second person, I'm accepted, therefore I obey, are both trying the best they can to live out the 10 Commandments, but for very different reasons and with very different outcomes. The person who understands the gospel is motivated by love and joy and gratitude. The other is motivated by fear. It's self-serving, really. If I do this, then God will get me what I want. The gospel lover says, why do I obey? To get God. Because I love God. I want more and more and more of him. The obey and then I'm accepted person's obedience is often conditional. Sometimes even we who do understand that deliverance comes first, even we who do love the gospel can let a legalistic mindset creep into our hearts and say things like, well, I've been doing everything pretty right and pretty good, and look, my life is really not turning out the way that I had hoped. And then look at her. I mean, she's not doing anything right, and everything is going great for her, and that just does not seem fair. if your mind goes there very often, you might want to ask yourself if you have the sequence wrong, and that maybe your obedience is conditional. Matthieu says that the blessings are yours, yet not yet yours. Blessings are there, and it's through obedience that you realize them. God says, you will be my treasure. Now, back in ancient days, kings owned absolutely everything. If you were the king's subject, then essentially you were his, and he could take everything you had if he wanted to. But there is a particular word here that's used that indicates the king's private, personal treasure, a special treasure. God already treasured them. He had saved them. He is asking that they obey into that kind of relationship through obedience is how we realize that kind of relationship. God says the whole earth is mine, but out of this whole earth you will be my special, personal, treasured possession. You will be my gem, my jewels. You know, when I first met my mother-in-law, this seems to be in-law day, so I may as well talk about it, right? The very first time I met my mother-in-law, she looked at me and she said, you know, your children are your jewels. And the second she said that, I just had this instant kinship with her. I instantly loved her and felt that I understood her and could relate to her. I have a whole house full of stuff, right? As I'm sure all of you do. But my children are my jewels. They are my gems. They are what I'm really proud of. This kind of affection that God is talking about here, the way that he addresses his people, is the way that a loving mother pours out her love for her special children. Don't miss how beautiful God's love for you is. Think back to when you first fell in love with your husband. You wanted to know everything there was to know about him. You wanted to know how you could please him. Tim Keller says you didn't maybe know you were doing it, but you were actually seeking the will of the beloved. You wanted to delight him. That's what we are to do. Seek the will of the beloved. That's what the gospel tells us to do. The gospel says you are accepted, therefore obey. Legalism says obey so that you'll be accepted. Most ancient cities were built around a ziggurat. And the priests would often go up to the ziggurat so that they could get closer to God. That's what the whole Tower of Babel was all about, a man's way of striving and getting to God. But Mount Sinai is God's ziggurat. All other religions say, do this, climb this ladder, walk up this ziggurat, and you will find God. But Christianity says, no, God finds you. God came down. We don't climb up. He came down. Moses was their mediator. Jesus is the ultimate mediator, the mediator of a new covenant. Hebrews 10:24 says his blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. What did the blood of Abel speak? He was murdered, and his blood cried out for vengeance. But the blood of Jesus cries out for grace, cries out with forgiveness and pardon, with accept them because I have already paid the penalty for them. When Jesus died on the cross, the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies in the temple, that was the place where God's presence dwelt. And that section of the temple was special. No one could go in there, and there was a curtain that separated it from the rest of the temple. But when Jesus died, that veil was torn in two from top to bottom. The veil between the presence of was torn, it was gone, because the ultimate mediator had done his work. We no longer approach a terrifying God cloaked in a thick cloud. That was another kind of a veil, another kind of a curtain, a way to separate God from his people. But the veil has been taken away, and we can now approach the throne of grace with confidence through the blood of our mediator, Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Lord, we praise you for your great love. We praise you that you are a parent like no other, that you do not love us conditionally, but that you have saved us and taken us, carried us on eagle's wings. Father, I pray that every person in this room will come to understand that and see that and want that and love that. I pray that we will be gospel-minded, gospel-loving people who say, I am accepted, therefore it is my delight to obey. That we willingly, lovingly, happily surrender ourselves to the Lordship of Christ. That we would live out his will for us, and that the world would see how good you are because of that choice. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.